The crystal champagne flutes were chiming against the backdrop of a perfect Christmas Eve dinner, the air thick with the scent of roasted pine and expensive perfume. Then, the laughter died instantly as my wife stood up, her hand trembling not with joy, but with a blind, cold rage that shattered the facade of our suburban perfection. The sharp sting of her palm across my face echoed louder than the silence, followed by 5 words that turned the holiday into a crime scene. You gave me a disease. The secret we had buried under layers of polite smiles was finally out, bleeding onto the white tablecloth. If you find yourself drawn to the fractured beauty of lives falling apart behind closed doors, stay with me. There are truths here that are too heavy to carry alone, and the night is far from over. The roast duck sat in the center of the mahogany table, glistening under the warm glow of the chandelier. It was a masterpiece of culinary effort, much like the evening itself. Daniel Thorne swirled the Pinot Noir in his glass, watching the crimson liquid coat the crystal. Around him, the hum of his family's conversation was a familiar, comforting blanket. His mother was recounting a story about the neighbor's golden retriever, and his father was nodding rhythmically, already half asleep from the wine. "It's truly wonderful, Martha," Elena said, her voice smooth and practiced. She was sitting to Daniel's right, her posture impeccable in a forest green velvet dress that accentuated the pale curve of her neck. Daniel glanced at his wife. She looked perfect. The diamond tennis bracelet he had given her 2 years ago caught the light as she sliced a piece of pear for her salad. But there was a tightness at the corner of her mouth, a microscopic tremor that only he, who had studied her face for 7 years, could detect. She hadn't touched her wine. "Is everything okay?" Daniel whispered, leaning in slightly so his sister, sitting across from them, wouldn't hear. Elena didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on her phone, which was resting face up on the tablecloth next to her silverware. The screen lit up, a notification, a simple banner from Northwestern Medicine, My Chart. Daniel felt a prick of irritation. No phones at the table, Mom hates it." Elena's hand moved slowly, her manicured fingers hovering over the screen. She unlocked it. Her eyes scanned the text, once, twice. Then, the air in the room seemed to vanish. The color drained from her face so rapidly that Daniel thought she might faint. "Elena?" She stood up. The movement was abrupt, jarring the table enough to make the silverware clatter. The conversation stopped. His mother paused mid-sentence, her fork suspended in the air. "Elena, dear?" his mother asked, concern etching her forehead. "Are you feeling unwell?" Elena turned to look at Daniel. The warmth he usually found in her hazel eyes was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated revulsion. It was a look one might give to a rotting carcass found on the side of the road. "You bastard," she whispered. The room was so quiet that the crackle of the fireplace sounded like a gunshot. "What?" Daniel half smiled, a nervous, reflexive reaction. What are you—" Smack! The sound was wet and sharp, echoing off the high ceilings. Daniel's head snapped to the side. The sting was instantaneous, a burning heat spreading across his left cheek, but the shock numbed him more than the pain. He stared at the centerpiece, at the holly and ivy, unable to process that his wife had just struck him. "Elena!" His father's voice boomed, finally breaking the paralysis. Elena didn't look at his parents. She kept her eyes locked on Daniel, her chest heaving, tears finally spilling over, hot and angry. "You dirty, lying son of a bitch!" she hissed, her voice rising to a shriek that tore through the festive atmosphere. You think you can just smile and play the perfect husband? I just got the results, Daniel. On Christmas Eve, I got the alert. Daniel's stomach dropped. A cold dread, heavier than anything he had ever felt, pooled in his gut. No, it can't be. Elena, let's go outside, Daniel stammered, reaching for her arm. Please, not here. She recoiled as if his touch were acid. Don't you touch me, do you hear me? Do not touch me with those hands. She turned to his mother, who was clutching her pearls, her mouth agape. Your son, Elena said, pointing a trembling finger at Daniel, gave me an STD, chlamydia. I have been faithful to him every single day of our marriage. Every single day. She turned back to Daniel, her voice breaking into a sob that was equal parts grief and fury. And you infected me. In front of your family, Daniel, tell them who you've been sleeping with. Daniel stood frozen, the burning on his cheek forgotten, replaced by the crushing weight of 20 pairs of eyes staring at him. The roast duck, the wine, the decorations, it all blurred into a grotesque carnival. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to say something, but the silence that followed was absolute. There was no way to fix this. The perfect picture had fallen off the wall, and the glass was everywhere. The silence that followed Elena's accusation was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, filling the dining room like rising water. Daniel felt the heat of the fireplace on his back, a stark contrast to the icy chill radiating from his father at the head of the table. His mother, usually the peacemaker, the woman who smoothed over every social gaffe with a laugh and a refill of wine, was staring at her plate. She could not look at him. That was worse than the slap. The shame on her face wasn't for herself. It was for him. A deep, disappointed resignation that he had failed to be the man she thought she raised. Daniel, his father said. His voice was low, devoid of the festive boom from moments ago. You should go. Dad, wait, it's not... Daniel started, his voice cracking. He reached a hand out, but his sister Sarah stood up abruptly, moving to stand between him and Elena, shielding his wife like a bodyguard. Just go, Daniel, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Can't you see what you've done? Just get out. Elena hadn't moved. She stood by the buffet table, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He wanted to go to her, to explain, to beg, to lie, anything to stop the shaking. But the wall of his family's judgment was impenetrable. Daniel turned and walked out of the dining room. The hallway seemed longer than he remembered. The family photos on the wall mocking him, pictures of him and Elena at their wedding, smiling, promising forever. He grabbed his coat from the rack, his movements mechanical, numb. The cold air of the Illinois winter hit him like a physical blow as he stepped onto the porch. Snow was falling, soft and silent, burying the driveway in white. It was ironic, he thought, as he fumbled for his keys. The world looked pristine, cleansed, while he felt covered in a layer of filth he couldn't scrub off. He sat in his Audi for a long time before starting the engine. The house glowed warm and golden through the windows. He could see the silhouette of his father pacing in the living room. He was outside of it now. The exile had begun. He didn't go back to their house in the city. Elena would go there, or perhaps she would stay here. He couldn't risk a second confrontation tonight. Instead, he drove aimlessly toward O'Hare, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a generic airport hotel. The lobby was empty, smelling of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. The night clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, barely looked at him as he handed over his credit card. He wondered if she could see the red mark on his cheek, if she knew he was a man who had just destroyed his own life. Room 412 was sterile. Beige walls, beige carpet, a generic abstract painting bolted to the wall. Daniel sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, still in his coat. He pulled his phone from his pocket. 12 missed calls. 7 from his brother. 3 from his mother. None from Elena. He stared at the black screen, and the memory he had pushed down for 6 months clawed its way to the surface. Seattle, the rain against the hotel window, the woman at the bar. Jessica? Jennifer? He couldn't even remember her name clearly. It had been a moment of weakness, fueled by too much scotch and a month of crushing pressure at the firm. He had told himself it was a stress reliever, a one-time lapse that would never touch his real life. He had used protection. He was sure of it. Or was he? The doubt bloomed in his chest, cold and sharp. Had the condom broken? Had he been too drunk to notice? He walked to the bathroom and turned on the fluorescent light. He looked at his reflection. The man in the mirror looked the same as the one who had put on a tie this morning, but his eyes were haunted. He touched his cheek where Elena had slapped him. If he really had given her something, if he had hurt her physically, permanently, the guilt would be unbearable. But beneath the guilt, a small, selfish voice whispered a terrifying question. How am I going to survive this? He turned on the tap, splashing freezing water onto his face, trying to wash away the sensation of the slap, the taste of the lie. But the water just ran down the drain, leaving him cold, wet, and utterly alone in the silent room. The city was gray, draped in the slushy aftermath of the Christmas snow. Daniel sat in the waiting room of an urgent care clinic in a strip mall 3 towns over, a place where he was certain he wouldn't run into a colleague or a neighbor. He wore a baseball cap pulled low and the collar of his coat turned up, though he knew the disguise was more for his own psychological comfort than any real anonymity. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and damp wool. A TV in the corner played a muted morning show, the hosts smiling manically in Santa hats, a cruel reminder of the timeline he was currently living in. Daniel looked down at the clipboard in his hands. The intake form was a maze of boxes, but his pen hovered over one section. Reason for visit. He checked the box marked STD screening. The ink looked dark and permanent against the white paper. Mr. Thorne? The nurse's voice made him jump. He stood up, clutching the clipboard against his chest like a shield, and followed her down the linoleum hallway. She was efficient, brisk, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking on the floor. She didn't look at him with judgment, just the weary indifference of someone working the day after a holiday. Inside the exam room, the air was colder. Daniel sat on the edge of the table, the crinkling paper beneath him sounding deafeningly loud in the small space. The doctor will be in shortly, the nurse said, closing the door. Alone again, Daniel's mind drifted back to Seattle. He closed his eyes, trying to reconstruct the night that had dismantled his life. It was June. The humidity had been stifling even in the rain. He remembered the hotel bar, dark wood, low light, the smell of expensive scotch. He remembered her laugh, smoky and easy. But the details of the act itself were blurred by the alcohol he had consumed to drown out the stress of the merger he was handling. He remembered a condom. He was almost certain of it. He remembered fumbling with the wrapper. But had it stayed on? Had he taken it off in a moment of drunken stupidity? The gaps in his memory were now canyons where catastrophe could hide. The door opened, and a young doctor with tired eyes entered, glancing at the chart. "Mr. Thorne, you're here for a full panel?" "Yes," Daniel said. His voice sounded rusty. "My wife, she tested positive. Chlamydia." The doctor nodded, his expression unchanging. He didn't ask about the wife. He didn't ask why Daniel was here alone on December 26th. He just put on gloves. "Okay. We'll do a urine sample and a blood draw to rule out everything else." "Symptoms?" "No. None." "That's common. Chlamydia is often asymptomatic in men," the doctor said, preparing a tourniquet. "It can sit there for months without you knowing." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. It can sit there for months. So it was possible. He could have brought the infection home in June, carried it like a dormant seed, and passed it to Elena weeks or months later. The timeline fit. The science fit. He watched the needle pierce the skin of his inner arm. The dark red blood flowed into the vial, swirling against the glass. It looked so ordinary. It didn't look like poison. It didn't look like the end of a marriage. "When will I know?" Daniel asked, pressing the cotton ball against the puncture wound. "Rapid results for some things, but for the full confirmation, usually 48 hours. The labs are backed up because of the holidays." 48 hours. 2 more days of purgatory. 2 more days of not knowing if he was just an adulterer or a man who had physically harmed the woman he promised to protect. Daniel walked out of the clinic 20 minutes later, a small bandage on his arm hidden beneath his cashmere coat. The wind bit at his face as he walked to his car. He felt lighter physically, having given the sample, but the dread had only solidified. He had taken the test. He had asked the question. Now he was at the mercy of the answer. The house was dark when Daniel pulled into the driveway, save for a single lamp burning in the study. It was the sort of house that usually looked inviting, a sprawling brick colonial that spoke of stability and generations of success. But tonight, it looked like a fortress he was trying to breach. He let himself in through the garage, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound greeting him. The Christmas tree was still up in the living room, its lights off, the ornaments dull in the shadows. It felt like walking through a museum exhibit of a life that had already been extinguished. He found Elena in the study. She wasn't crying. She wasn't drinking. She was sitting at his mahogany desk, a place she rarely occupied, with a legal pad and a stack of file folders arranged with geometric precision in front of her. "Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't look up. Her pen scratched across the paper, a dry, rhythmic sound that grated on his nerves. "You shouldn't be here, Daniel. I told your sister to tell you to stay away." "I live here," he said, stepping fully into the room. He felt stripped raw, the exhaustion of the hotel and the anxiety of the clinic visit weighing him down. "We need to talk. I can't do this over text or through my parents." Elena finally stopped writing. She set the pen down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the pad. She looked at him then, her face a mask of porcelain smoothness. There was no redness around the eyes, no puffiness. She looked immaculate, terrifyingly composed. "There is nothing to talk about," she said. "You made your statement loud and clear at the dinner table when you sat there in silence." "I was in shock," Daniel pleaded, moving toward the chair opposite the desk, but not daring to sit. "Elena, listen to me. I went to the doctor. I got tested today. I'm waiting for the results." She laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "A little late for due diligence, isn't it?" Daniel gripped the back of the leather chair. This was it. The moment he had rehearsed in the car 100 times. The truth. "It was one night," he blurted out. The words hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. 6 months ago, Seattle, the merger trip. I was drunk, and I was stressed, and it was a mistake. A meaningless, stupid mistake. I thought I was careful. If I gave you this, if I made you sick, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." He waited for the explosion. He waited for her to scream, to throw the stapler at him, to cry. Instead, Elena just nodded. It was a small, confirming nod, as if he had just agreed to a dinner reservation she suggested. "Seattle," she repeated. "June. I thought as much." She opened the top folder on the stack. Inside, Daniel saw the letterhead of a prominent Chicago divorce firm, one known for its shark-like tactics. "I've already retained counsel, Daniel," she said, her voice flat and businesslike. "This admission helps, though. It simplifies things. Adultery, exposing a spouse to a communicable disease. It invalidates the infidelity clause in the prenup. You know that, don't you? You're a lawyer." Daniel stared at the folder. She had moved so fast. It had been less than 48 hours since the dinner. You already have a lawyer?" "I protect myself, Daniel, since you clearly won't." She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I want you out of the house by tonight, officially. I'll have the locks changed tomorrow. My lawyer will be in touch with yours regarding the asset freeze." "Elena, stop," Daniel said, his voice rising. "I'm talking about our marriage, about us. I'm admitting I screwed up. Doesn't that count for anything? I'm telling you the truth." "The truth?" She walked around the desk, stopping just inches from him. Her eyes were cold, dead things. "The truth is, you humiliated me. You compromised my health. And now you want credit for admitting it because you got caught?" She walked past him to the door. "Pack a bag, Daniel, whatever you can carry. Leave the rest, and don't come back until the court orders it." Daniel stood alone in the study. He had expected anger. He had expected grief. He hadn't expected this clinical dismantling of his life. He looked at the legal pad she had left behind. It was a list of assets. The house, the brokerage accounts, the cars. She hadn't just been hurt. She had been preparing. And as the front door clicked shut upstairs, Daniel realized with a sinking dread that while he was playing checkers with his conscience, Elena was playing chess with his life. The 48th floor of the Thorne and Associates building offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, a vast expanse of gray water meeting a gray sky. Daniel stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his forehead resting against the cold glass. Behind him, his desk was piled high with merger documents he hadn't touched in hours. He was technically working, but in reality, he was waiting. It had been 2 days since he left the house with a duffel bag. 2 days of sleeping in the hotel, showering in a cramped stall, and wearing shirts that the dry cleaner hadn't pressed quite right. His phone sat on the desk, silent. Elena hadn't called. His parents hadn't called. The isolation was absolute. A soft ping from his laptop broke the silence. Daniel turned. A notification banner slid onto the screen. Quest Diagnostics. Your test results are ready. His heart kicked against his ribs, a hard, erratic rhythm. This was the final nail. He walked to the desk, his legs feeling heavy, as if he were wading through water. He sat down, his hand hovering over the mouse. He expected to see the word positive. He had already accepted it. He had already confessed to it. He just needed to see the confirmation so he could stop hoping. He clicked the link. The portal loaded slowly, the spinning wheel mocking his anxiety. Finally, the page refreshed. Panel ID 7844B patient. Daniel J. Thorne. Date of service 12/26. He scrolled down, his eyes scanning for the red text, the flags, the warnings. HIV 1-2 screen, non-reactive. Hepatitis panel, negative. Syphilis, RPR, non-reactive. Neisseria gonorrhoeae, NAA, negative. Chlamydia trachomatis, NAA, negative. Daniel stopped. He blinked, certain he had misread the line. He leaned closer to the screen, tracing the row with his finger. Chlamydia trachomatis, NAOA, negative. Negative. He whispered to the empty room. He sat back, the leather chair creaking. He read it again, and a third time. Negative. Confusion washed over him, followed by a surge of panic. Had the test been done too soon? No, the doctor said Seattle was 6 months ago. If he had contracted it then, it would be screamingly positive by now. He grabbed his phone and dialed the clinic, bypassing the front desk to ask for Dr. Evans. "This is Daniel Thorne," he said, when the doctor finally picked up, his voice tight. "I just got my results. Everything is negative." "That's good news, Mr. Thorne." The doctor's voice was calm, professional. "But my wife," Daniel stammered, his legal mind trying to piece together a fractured timeline. "She tested positive. She has symptoms. If I gave it to her, I have to have it, right? Is it possible I had it, gave it to her, and then my body just cleared it? It's highly unlikely for a bacterial infection like chlamydia to spontaneously clear in men without treatment, especially if you were the carrier for 6 months," Dr. Evans explained. "And if you were the source of her active infection, you would almost certainly still be testing positive. The incubation period is days to weeks, not half a year without a trace." "So," Daniel said, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles turned white. "If I am negative, then I didn't give it to her. Medically speaking, based on these results, you are not the source of a current chlamydia infection," the doctor confirmed. Daniel ended the call. He stared at the city skyline, but the gray had shifted. The crushing weight of the guilt that had been suffocating him for 3 days suddenly lifted, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He had cheated. Yes, that was a fact. He had admitted to Seattle, but he hadn't given her a disease. He replayed the dinner in his mind, the way Elena had looked at her phone, the timing, Christmas Eve, the public slap, the specificity of the accusation, "You gave me a disease." She had been so sure. She had been so righteous in her anger. But if he was clean, then where did her infection come from? A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down his spine. There were only 2 mathematical possibilities. Either the test was wrong, which Dr. Evans seemed to dismiss, or Elena hadn't gotten the disease from him. And if she hadn't gotten it from him, she had gotten it from someone else. Daniel looked at the divorce papers she had served him, the asset freeze, the speed of her legal maneuvering. He had thought she was efficient in her grief. Now, looking at the word negative glowing on his screen, it didn't look like grief anymore. It looked like a strategy. He wasn't the monster she had painted him to be, or at least, he wasn't the only one. The printer in the corner of the office hummed rhythmically, spitting out the single page that vindicated Daniel's body, if not his soul. Negative. He picked up the paper, the warmth of the fresh ink seeping into his fingertips. It was a shield, thin and fragile, but it was enough to stop the bleeding. Daniel sat back down at his desk. The city lights of Chicago were blinking on below him, a grid of electricity and movement. but his world had narrowed to the 14-inch screen of his laptop. For the last 48 hours, he had been paralyzed by the narrative Elena had constructed. The loyal, victimized wife and the reckless, diseased husband. It was a story so compelling that even his own family had bought tickets to the show. But the test result created a crack in the story. And as a lawyer, Daniel knew that once you found a crack, you didn't just stare at it. You hammered a wedge into it until the whole structure came down. He opened a new browser window. His fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second over the keyboard, a reflex of the privacy he used to respect, before typing in the password for their joint American Express account. Elena was meticulous with money, usually handling the household finances, but she hadn't removed his access yet. Perhaps she was too confident in his guilt to think he would look. Perhaps she thought he was too broken to fight back. He navigated to the transaction history. "Okay, Elena," he whispered, the blue light of the monitor casting hollow shadows on his face. "Let's see your timeline." He ignored June. He ignored July. If the doctor was right, and her symptoms had just appeared leading up to Christmas, the infection was recent. Chlamydia didn't usually lie dormant and then explode with such violent timing unless the exposure was fresh. He scrolled to November, the screen filled with the mundane debris of their upper-middle-class life. Whole Foods, Pilates membership, the dry cleaner, Amazon purchases for Christmas gifts. It looked innocent. It looked perfect. But Daniel knew how to look for the negative space, the things that weren't there. He pulled up his own calendar on the second monitor. He cross-referenced dates. November 12th through 15th. He had been in New York for a deposition. Elena had told him she was staying low-key, just working and prepping for the gallery's winter exhibition. He looked at the credit card statement for November 14th. Uber Technologies, $40.50, 10:15 p.m. The Aviary, $184 no, 11:30 p.m. Uber Technologies, $12, 02:15 a.m. Daniel frowned. The Aviary was a cocktail bar in the West Loop, trendy and expensive. Not the kind of place Elena went to stay low-key, and certainly not alone. The bill was nearly $200. Too much for one person, just enough for 2 rounds of their signature cocktails. He traced the Uber ride. The $12 ride at 2:15 a.m. didn't go back to their house in Evanston. That would have been a $50 fare minimum. A $12 ride meant she went somewhere local, somewhere in the city. He felt a cold sweat prickling the back of his neck. He wasn't looking at a dinner receipt. He was looking at a pattern. He jumped to December, the first week. He had a late night at the firm on a Tuesday. Elena had said she was going to her mother's for dinner. He checked the statement. No Uber, no gas station fill-up near her parents' house in Winnetka, but there was a charge for a parking garage on State Street, downtown, and a charge at a boutique lingerie shop on Michigan Avenue at 5:45 p.m. Daniel closed his eyes. The image of Elena standing at the Christmas dinner table, her face twisted in righteous fury, flashed in his mind. I have been faithful to him every single day of our marriage. The conviction in her voice had been Oscar-worthy. But looking at the glowing numbers on the screen, Daniel realized it wasn't conviction. It was projection. It was the desperate, clawing panic of someone who had gotten caught in her own biological trap and needed a scapegoat before the walls closed in. She hadn't slapped him because he gave her a disease. She had slapped him because she had contracted one, and destroying him was the only way to hide her own sin. Daniel opened a new folder on his desktop. He named it simply Defense. He began to download the statements as PDFs. The guilt that had been eating him alive since Christmas Eve began to harden into something colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. He wasn't the only one with a secret in Seattle. It seemed Elena had a secret right here in Chicago, and unlike his, hers was still active. The key still worked. Daniel had expected resistance, a changed lock, a security chain, perhaps even the police waiting in the driveway. But the heavy oak door swung open with a familiar, well-oiled silence. The house was quiet, steeped in the mid-morning gloom of a cloudy winter day. It felt less like a home and more like a stage set after the actors had gone home. He found Elena in the living room. She was sitting on the beige sofa, her legs tucked underneath her, staring at the unlit fireplace. She held a mug of tea with both hands, the steam rising in thin, curling ribbons. When she heard his footsteps, she didn't jump. She simply turned her head, her expression weary rather than angry. "I told you not to come back," she said softly. There was no venom in it this time, just a tired resignation. "My lawyer is filing the emergency motion today." "I know," Daniel said. He didn't take off his coat. He walked to the coffee table, the same table where, just days ago, they had opened gifts, and placed a single sheet of paper on the glass surface. It was the printout from Quest Diagnostics. Elena looked at the paper, then up at him. "What is this? Another confession?" "It's my test results," Daniel said. His voice was steady, anchored by the cold, hard fact sitting between them. "I'm negative, Elena, all across the board. Chlamydia, gonorrhea, everything. Negative." Elena's grip on the mug tightened. Her knuckles turned the color of bone. She didn't reach for the paper. She didn't need to read it. She knew what it meant. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted away from his, fixing on a point on the rug. "It's not impossible," Daniel said, stepping closer. "The doctor said if I had given it to you, if I had been carrying it since Seattle, I would still have it. But I don't, which means I didn't give it to you." He let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. He watched the realization wash over her, stripping away the armor of the grieving wife. "I saw the credit card statements, Elle," he added quietly. "The aviary, the late-night Ubers, the gap in November when I was in New York." Elena closed her eyes. A single tear leaked out, tracking through the perfect foundation she wore even inside the house. She set the mug down on the table with a trembling hand. The ceramic clinked loudly against the glass. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said, her voice cracking. "Who is he?" Daniel asked. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching two strangers discuss a car accident. "It doesn't matter," she said, shaking her head. "A curator, from the gallery. It was just excitement, Daniel. You were always working, always distant. I felt invisible." "So you slept with him," Daniel said. "And you caught something." "I didn't know." She looked up at him then, her face crumpled in genuine anguish. "I didn't know until that moment at dinner, when the notification popped up. I panicked. I saw the word positive, and my whole life flashed before my eyes. Your parents were there. Sarah was there. Everyone was looking at me." She took a shuddering breath. "I knew I hadn't slept with you in weeks. If I admitted I had it, I would be admitting I cheated. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let them see me like that. So I just reacted." "You slapped me," Daniel said. "You destroyed me in front of my family to save yourself." "I was scared," Elena sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I was so scared, Daniel. I projected it onto you because it was the only way out. I thought, I thought if I made you the villain, no one would look at me closely enough to see the truth. Daniel looked down at his wife, the woman he had built a life with, the woman he had betrayed in Seattle, and who had betrayed him in Chicago. They were both standing in the wreckage of their own making. He had cheated to escape the pressure. She had cheated to escape the loneliness. And in the end, they had both used their marriage as a weapon. You wanted a divorce, Daniel said, his voice hollow. You hired the shark lawyer. You tried to freeze the assets. You weren't just scared, Elena. You were capitalizing on it. She didn't answer. Her silence was the loudest confirmation he had ever heard. Daniel reached down and picked up the medical report. He folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. He didn't need to leave it there. He knew the truth now, and more importantly, she knew that he knew. I'll have my lawyer call yours, Daniel said, but we're not doing this on your terms anymore. He turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, he heard the soft, pathetic sound of Elena weeping, not for the loss of their marriage, but for the loss of her perfect, carefully constructed image. The ink on the settlement agreement was barely dry, but the weight of the document felt ancient in Daniel's hands. It was done. The dissolution of the marriage between Daniel James Thorne and Elena Marie Thorne was absolute, reduced to 24 pages of legal jargon and a division of assets that felt more like an autopsy than a breakup. Daniel stood in the center of his new apartment in River North. It was a far cry from the sprawling Colonial in Evanston. This place was glass, steel, and concrete. Modern, cold, and unapologetically solitary. The floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Chicago River, the water churning dark and gray as the last of the winter ice finally melted away. He walked to the kitchen island and poured himself a glass of water. He didn't want alcohol. He hadn't touched a drop since that night in the hotel room. The clarity he had fought for was too expensive to blur now. The last 3 months had been a blur of billable hours and legal maneuvering. Once Elena realized Daniel held the medical evidence of her own infidelity, the fight had drained out of her. There were no screaming matches, no court dates, just a quiet surrender. She had packed her things and moved back to the East Coast within a week, leaving the house in Evanston echoing with the ghost of their 7 years together. Daniel thought about his family. The truth had eventually come out. Sarah had made sure of that. His mother had called, weeping, apologizing for the dinner, for the judgment, for the silence. His father had invited him over for Sunday roast as if nothing had happened. But things had happened. The slap at the dinner table had broken more than just trust. It had shattered the illusion of their perfect family unit. Daniel went to the dinners now, but he sat at the table like a guest, polite and distant, watching them play the part of the happy family while knowing how quickly they could turn. He picked up his phone. No notifications, no drama, no lies. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent months terrified of a disease he didn't have, only to realize that the marriage itself had been the infection. It was a silent, creeping sickness built on appearances, on the pressure to be the golden couple, on the suppression of unhappiness until it sought release in a hotel room in Seattle or a curator's bed in Chicago. They were both guilty. He had cheated first, perhaps. She had cheated more recently, but the real crime was the performance. They had performed happiness for an audience until the curtain caught fire. Daniel walked to the window and pressed his hand against the glass. Below, the city was waking up. Commuters were rushing across the bridges, tiny ants marching toward their skyscrapers. Life was moving on, indifferent to the wreckage of his personal world. He was 36 years old. He was a partner at his firm. He was wealthy. And for the first time in a decade, he was completely, utterly alone. The disease was gone. The test was negative. The account was settled. But as he looked at his reflection in the darkening window, a man with a clean bill of health and an empty heart, Daniel realized that some stains didn't show up on a lab report. They were just part of the person you became after the fire went out. He turned away from the window, leaving the city lights behind him, and walked into the quiet of his new life.